The old majestic theater stood at the corner of Fifth and Elm like a sleeping giant that the world had forgotten. 50 years ago, this place was the heart of the city. On Saturday nights, the marquee lights would blaze so bright they turned the low clouds orange, and the sound of applause would spill out into the street, mixing with the smell of roasted nuts and expensive perfume. But that was a long time ago. Now the bulbs in the sign were broken, the doors were boarded up with heavy plywood, and the only smell coming from the place was wet dust and rotting wood. To the city planners, it was an eyesore. It was a safety hazard. It was a block of prime real estate that was wasting space. In just 2 weeks, the wrecking ball was scheduled to swing. The permits were signed, the contracts were sealed, and a large, cold parking lot was scheduled to take its place. The city needed places for cars, not memories of a time that nobody remembered anymore. On a Tuesday afternoon in late November, the sky turned a bruised purple and opened up. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a cold, driving sheets of water kind of rain that soaked through coats and ruined shoes. Maya was running late. At 23, she was still trying to figure out the shape of her own life, working 2 jobs just to keep a small apartment and trying to hold on to the dream of being a musician that her guidance counselors had told her wasn't practical. She was carrying a bag of groceries and a heavy violin case on her back, slipping on the wet pavement. Looking for anywhere to get out of the storm, she saw the archway of the Majestic. The main doors were boarded shut, but to the side, there was a service entrance that had been forced open years ago. Without thinking, she ducked under the leaking marquee and squeezed through the gap in the plywood inside. The air was still. It was that specific kind of heavy, dusty silence that you only find in places that have been abandoned for a long time. Maya shook the water from her hair and stood there for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the gloom. The lobby was a mess of shattered tiles and peeling paint, but she could still see the ghost of what it used to be. The ticket booth stood like a lonely sentry, its glass shattered, watching over a room that had no people. She stepped further in, her footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. She wasn't supposed to be here. She knew that. There were probably warning signs about trespassing and asbestos. But the rain was hammering the roof outside, and for some reason, she felt pulled forward. She walked through the velvet ropes that hung limp and rotting in the lobby and pushed open the heavy inner doors that led to the auditorium. What she saw made her catch her breath. The auditorium was vast, a cavernous room that seemed to go on forever in the dark. The ceiling was a mess of holes and water stains, letting shafts of gray light fall onto the seats below. The seats themselves were ripped open, their foam spilling out like guts. But despite the ruin, there was a certain majesty to it. The balconies on either side still clung to the walls, and the great dome ceiling, though cracked, still loomed high above. And then in the center of it all, sitting alone on the stage in a single spotlight of gray light, was the piano. It was a grand piano, massive and black. It looked like a ship that had been wrecked on a deserted island. It was covered in a thick layer of gray cloth, shroud meant to protect it from the elements, but the cloth was sagging now, heavy with dust. It looked abandoned, forgotten, left behind to rot while the world moved on. Maya walked down the aisle. She avoided the largest puddles, stepping carefully over the debris that littered the floor. As she got closer to the stage, she slowed down. There was a feeling here, a heavy pressure in her chest. She knew what it felt like to be left behind. She knew what it felt like to have potential, but to be put in a corner, covered up and ignored. She climbed the 3 steps onto the stage. The wood groaned under her weight, a low, creaking sound that echoed through the empty hall. She stood in front of the piano for a long time. The rain drummed loudly on the roof above, rhythmic tapping that sounded like nervous fingers. She reached out and pulled the corner of the gray cloth. It slid off the instrument with a soft whoosh, sending a cloud of dust into the damp air. Underneath, the piano was beautiful. It was scratched, and the finish was dull in the dim light, but the shape of it was perfect. It was a beast of an instrument, 9 feet of wood, wire, and iron. Maya gently ran her hand along the curve of the side. It was cold to the touch. She sat down on the bench. It wobbled slightly, one leg shorter than the others, but it held her. She looked at the keys. They were yellowed with age, some of them chipped, but they were all there. Maya was a pianist first, a violinist second. The piano had always been her way of speaking when she couldn't find the words. Since her grandmother had passed away 6 months ago, Maya hadn't played a single note. The grief had sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold. She had sold her own keyboard to pay for the funeral bills. She hadn't touched the keys since. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. She felt silly. She was sitting in a condemned building, in the dark, playing a piano that probably hadn't been tuned in decades. She should leave. She should go back out into the rain and catch the bus to her apartment and forget she ever saw this place. But she didn't move. The wrecking ball was coming in 2 weeks. This instrument, this piece of history, was going to be smashed into splinters. It was going to be thrown into a dumpster and hauled away to make room for cars. It seemed like such a tragic, lonely end. Maya took a deep breath. The air tasted of old paper and rain. She didn't press down hard. She just wanted to hear a voice. She extended her index finger and gently pressed the middle C ping. The sound wasn't perfect. It was slightly tinny, a little dull, but it rang out. It didn't thud dead like she expected. The sound traveled away from the piano, bouncing off the back wall of the theater, filling the empty space. It was a clear singing note that hung in the air for a surprisingly long time before fading away. Maya blinked. She pressed another key, then a chord. She put both hands on the keyboard and played a simple major triad. The sound swelled. In that empty, ruined hall, the piano was louder than she expected. It had a voice that wanted to be heard. The vibrations hummed through the bench and up into her bones. For a second, the coldness in her chest cracked. The stone of grief felt just a little bit lighter. She looked around the vast dark room. She thought about the thousands of people who had sat here in the 1940s and 50s, laughing and clapping. She thought about the musicians who had stood on this stage, pouring their hearts out. And she thought about how quiet it had been for so long. Maya realized then that the building wasn't dead. It was just waiting. It was waiting for someone to listen. She looked at the demolition order she had seen posted on the door. Outside, just a piece of paper with cold legal words. She looked back at the keys. No, she whispered to the empty room. The word was barely audible, but it felt solid. She wasn't a developer. She didn't have money. She didn't have power. But sitting there in the dust, the rain tapping on the roof, and the single note still echoing faintly in the distance, Maya made a decision. She didn't know how she would do it, and she didn't know if it would even work. But she couldn't let this die. She gently placed her hands on the keys again. Ready to play? Not a song, but a promise to the ghosts in the room. The fate of the landmark hung in the balance, and it all started with the touch of her hands. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the gray sky hung low over the city like a wet blanket. Maya stood outside the majestic theater again, but this time she wasn't running from a storm. She was carrying a heavy backpack filled with tools she had borrowed from her uncle's garage. She had a tuning hammer, a few rubber wedges, and a small flashlight. She didn't really know how to fix a piano, not professionally, but she knew enough to understand that this one was sick, and sick things need care, not abandonment. When she squeezed back through the gap in the plywood, the silence of the theater greeted her. It felt heavier today, as if the building knew that the deadline was 2 weeks shorter than it was yesterday. She walked down the aisle, stepping over the same debris, and climbed onto the stage. The piano sat there waiting, exactly as she had left it. It looked lonely in the vast, dusty space. She set her flashlight down on the music rack, the beam cutting through the gloom and lighting up the yellowed keys. She opened the top lid of the piano, the fallboard, and peered inside. It was a forest of strings and felt cast iron plates painted gold, red felt dampers, and steel wires that looked rusty and tired. It was complicated and messy, much like her own life had felt recently. For the next 4 hours, Maya worked in silence. She didn't play any music. She didn't try to play a song. Instead, she started to work on the mechanics. She used the rubber wedges to mute the strings so she could hear one note at a time. She placed the tuning hammer over the first pin. It was stiff, rusted in place from years of neglect. She had to lean her whole body weight into it just to get it to budge. Screech. The metal groaned as she turned the pin. It was a terrible sound, like an old gate complaining in the wind. She flinched, looking around as if the ghosts of the theater were angry at her for disturbing them. But she kept going. This work became a kind of therapy for her. For the last 6 months, ever since the funeral, Maya had felt like she was floating outside of her own life, watching things happen but not really participating. She went to work, she ate, she slept, but she didn't feel anything. But here, forcing a rusted pin to turn, struggling against the physical resistance of the instrument, she felt something real. She felt the strain in her wrist. She felt the grease on her fingers. She felt the determination to fix just one small thing in a world that felt broken. She wasn't just tuning a piano. She was untangling the knot in her own chest. Every string she tightened felt like she was tightening her own grip on life. Around noon, the heavy service door at the back of the hall creaked open. Maya froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was trespassing after all. She expected a police officer or maybe a city inspector telling her to get out. A shadow moved in the doorway. An old man stepped in, wearing a coat that was too thin for the weather and a cap pulled low over his eyes. He was leaning on a broom that looked as old as the theater itself. It was the caretaker. Maya had seen him sweeping the sidewalks outside sometimes, a man who moved slowly and spoke to no one. He looked like a part of the building gray, dusty and quiet. Maya stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans. I'm sorry, she stammered. I'm not stealing anything. I just wanted to... She didn't know how to finish the sentence. The old man didn't say a word. He just looked at her, his eyes moving from her face to the open piano and then back to her. He didn't look angry. He looked surprised. He stepped further into the hall, the sound of his broom tapping against the floor marking his steps. He walked all the way to the front row and sat down heavily on one of the broken seats. You're the first person to open that lid in 20 years, he said. His voice was gravelly, like dry leaves skittering on pavement. Maya sat back down on the bench. It's out of tune, she said softly. Everything here is out of tune, the old man replied. He looked up at the hole in the ceiling. Heating's gone. The roof leaks. The rats have taken over the balcony. He sighed, a long, weary sound. They say they're bringing the ball in 14 days. Going to turn us into a parking lot. I know, Maya said. Why bother? He asked. It wasn't a mean question. It was a genuine question from a man who had watched things fall apart for too long. Why fix something that's already dead? Maya looked at the keys. She thought about her grandmother. The nurses had stopped coming into the room at the end because they said there was nothing more they could do. But Maya had stayed. She had held her hand. She had talked to her. Because being there matters. 'Cause it's not dead yet, Maya said. She picked up the tuning hammer again. It's just sleeping. The old man watched her for a long time. He didn't leave. Eventually, he took out a handkerchief and wiped some dust off the armrest of his chair. They sat there in the quiet, the young woman and the old man, while the rain started to tap against the roof again. For the next 3 days, this became their routine. Maya would come in the morning, and the old man whose name she learned was Arthur would let her in. Sometimes he would sweep the lobby. But mostly he would sit in the front row and listen to the ping and plunk of the tuning process. He didn't talk much, and neither did she. They didn't need to. There was a comfort in the shared silence, a mutual understanding that they were both fighting a losing battle, but fighting it anyway. On the 4th day, Maya finally finished the middle section of the keyboard. Her fingers were blistered and her back ached from bending over the piano for hours. She stood up and stretched. The dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight, swirling in the air like tiny stars. Arthur, she said softly, I think it's ready for a song. The old man looked up. He looked tired, his face a map of wrinkles, but his eyes were alert. Maya sat down. She didn't play a complex classical piece. She didn't have the energy for that. She played a simple melody, something she had made up as a child. She pressed down the keys, unsure of what would happen. The sound that came out wasn't perfect. It was still a little nasal in the lower register and brittle in the high notes, but it was loud. It was clear. And more importantly, it sang. The notes floated out from the piano, hitting the back wall and bouncing back. The acoustics of the theater, even in its ruined state, caught the sound and cradled it. The music filled the entire cavernous room. It seemed to chase away the shadows in the corners. It seemed to warm the cold, damp air. Maya closed her eyes and let her fingers move. She played the grief she felt, the loneliness of the empty room, and the tiny spark of hope she had found in this dusty place. The music swelled, a wave of sound crashing against the silence. When she finally lifted her hands off the keys, the note hung in the air for a long time, fading slowly into the darkness. She opened her eyes and looked at Arthur. The old man wasn't looking at the piano. He was looking at the ceiling, his hand resting on his chest. Maya saw a single tear track its way through the dust on his cheek, cutting a clean line through the grime. For 20 years, Arthur had swept the floors of this tomb, listening to the wind howl through the broken windows. He had forgotten what it sounded like when the building was alive. He had forgotten that this place used to make people feel things. He looked at Maya, and for the first time he smiled. It was a small, crooked thing, but it was genuine. "Sounds like a home again," he whispered. Maya looked around the rotting hall. It was still falling apart. The demolition crew was still coming in 10 days, but for the first time in a long time, the building didn't feel like a corpse. It felt like a heart that had just started beating. She smiled back at him, and in that moment, she knew she couldn't let the city win. This piano had found its voice again, and now it had something to say. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Every afternoon, the girl with the violin case would arrive, and the old caretaker would unlock the side door. The word spread through the neighborhood, not with a shout, but like a rumor passed in a whisper. People started to notice the change in the air around the old, majestic theater. The heavy, depressed feeling that used to hang over the block seemed to lift just a little. The sound of the piano drifting out through the cracks in the plywood and the broken vents was like a heartbeat returning to a body that had been still for too long. It wasn't loud music. It was gentle, mournful, and incredibly beautiful. People walking their dogs would stop on the sidewalk. Drivers waiting at the red light on the corner would roll down their windows, ignoring the honking horns behind them, just to catch a few bars of the melody drifting through the air. It felt like a secret that the whole city was sharing. One evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, turning the sky a deep bruised purple, a young teenager named Leo found his way to the back of the theater. Leo was 17 and usually spent his afternoons skateboarding in the empty lot behind the old buildings. He had heard the music for days, a ghostly sound that mixed weirdly with the rumble of traffic and the noise of the city. Curiosity got the better of him. He found the same loose board that Maya used. He squeezed through, scraping his elbow on the rough wood, and found himself in the dark lobby. He walked quietly, his sneakers squeaking faintly on the dusty floor. He pushed open the inner doors and stopped. The auditorium was dim. The only light came from the sunset pouring through the holes in the roof and a single work lamp Maya had set up on the stage. It cast a warm golden circle around the piano. Dust motes danced in the light like tiny fireflies. And there she was. Maya was sitting at the grand piano, wearing a simple, oversized sweater. Her back was to him, her posture relaxed but focused. She was playing Chopin. It was a piece full of longing and sadness. Notes that climbed high and then fell back down, sliding into the lower registers. Leo stood in the shadows at the back of the hall. He didn't know anything about classical music. He knew about rap beats and rock bands, but this was different. This was raw. It didn't feel like a performance. It felt like she was pouring out everything she had onto the keys. He watched the way her shoulders moved with the music, the way her hair fell over her face. He looked at the ruined theater around Hertha, peeling paint, the tattered curtains, and the contrast hit him hard. It was like seeing a flower growing out of a crack in the concrete. He pulled his phone out of his pocket. He knew he wasn't supposed to be there, and he knew she probably wouldn't want to be recorded. But he felt like the world needed to see this. He needed to capture the feeling of the room, not just the audio. He held his phone up. keeping his hands steady to avoid the shake. He zoomed in slightly. The frame captured Maya in her circle of light. The massive black curve of the piano and the dark, empty rows of seats stretching out behind her into the darkness. The audio picked up the clear, resonant sound of the strings, mixed with the faint rumble of the city outside and the distant sound of a siren. It was perfectly imperfect. He recorded for 2 minutes until the song ended. When the last note faded into the silence, Leo quickly stopped the recording and slipped back out the way he came. His heart was beating fast. He sat on his skateboard in the alleyway behind the theater and looked at the video on his phone. It looked like a memory. He uploaded it to his social media. He didn't add a bunch of hashtags. He didn't try to be funny. He simply typed, "She's bringing the ghost back to life." Hashtag the Majestic. He posted it and put his phone back in his pocket, thinking maybe a few of his friends would like it. But the internet works in mysterious ways. By the time the streetlights flickered on outside the theater, the video had been shared a dozen times. When the sun came up the next morning, it had been shared 5,000 times. By noon, the number was in the millions. Inside the theater, Maya had no idea. She was sitting on the edge of the stage, eating a sandwich she had brought, listening to Arthur tell stories about the theater in the 1950s. She laughed as he described the time a famous singer had arrived. With 12 suitcases and a parrot, Arthur pointed toward the heavy double doors at the front of the lobby. "There's a lot of noise out there today," he said. "More than usual." Maya hopped off the stage and walked to the lobby. She peeked through a crack in the plywood boarding the main entrance. Her eyes went wide. The sidewalk was packed. There were reporters with microphones and cameras. There were news vans parked along the street, their satellite dishes pointed up at the gray sky. There were hundreds of people standing, their old couples holding hands, college students, workers on their lunch break. They weren't shouting or protesting. They were just standing there quietly, looking at the old building with reverence. A reporter was speaking into a camera, and Maya could hear her voice through the crack. "The video has touched a nerve across the country," the reporter was saying. "In a world that feels increasingly divided and noisy, the image of a young woman saving a piece of history in the silence of a ruined theater has become a symbol of hope." Maya stepped back, her hands shaking. She looked at Arthur. "Arthur, they're here because of me?" Arthur grinned, showing his few remaining teeth. "They're here because of the music, kid. The music is the truth. People are hungry for the truth." That night, something even more strange happened. The sun went down, and the news crews packed up and left. But the people didn't leave. They stood on the sidewalk in the cold. Someone brought candles. Then someone else brought a small speaker to play the video so everyone could hear the music. Soon, a soft glow of candlelight was flickering against the plywood outside. Inside, Maya sat at the piano. She could see the faint light through the cracks. She felt a responsibility now. It wasn't just her and Arthur anymore. It felt like the whole city was holding its breath, waiting for her to speak. She started to play. She chose a piece that was soft and gentle. As the music drifted out through the cracks, the chatter on the sidewalk stopped completely. Hundreds of people stood in the dark, listening to the piano playing from inside the abandoned building. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, connected by the sound. Some people cried. Some people just closed their eyes and let the music wash over them, forgetting their rent problems and their work stress for a few minutes. It was a moment of pure peace in a chaotic world. The Majestic Theater wasn't a ruin anymore. It had transformed overnight into a shrine. It was a place where the past and the present met. And the girl who had just wanted to hide from the rain was now the heartbeat of the entire city. She played until her fingers hurt. She played until the candlelights outside burned low. And when she finally stopped, the silence that followed was louder than any applause she had ever heard. The day of the final vote arrived under a sky that was aggressively gray, matching the mood of the city council chambers. The large room smelled of floor wax and old paper, the scent of bureaucracy that Maya had always found slightly suffocating. Today, however, the room felt different. It was buzzing with a low hum of energy. the kind that happens right before a storm breaks. Maya sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt small. She was wearing her best dress, a simple blue one. She had found at a thrift store, but she still felt out of place among the men in expensive suits and the women with perfect haircuts. Next to her sat Arthur, the old caretaker, wearing his only good jacket and holding his hat in his lap. He looked nervous, his knee bouncing up and down. The room was packed. Every seat was filled, and people were standing along the back walls. These weren't the usual people who attended city council meetings. There were no lawyers or developers. Instead, the room was filled with the people who had stood outside the theater with candles. There were young people with headphones around their necks, elderly neighbors who remembered the Majestic in its prime, and mothers holding babies. They had come to defend a pile of bricks that had suddenly become the soul of the neighborhood. At the front of the room, the city council members sat behind a long, curved desk. They looked tired and uncomfortable. The mayor sat in the middle, looking down at a stack of papers. Beside the mayor sat the representative from the development company. He was a man with a shiny watch and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He clicked his pen repeatedly, a sound that seemed to echo in Maya's ears like a ticking clock. "Order," the mayor said, banging a gavel. "We are here to discuss the demolition permit for the old Majestic Theater." The developer stood up. He smoothed his tie and looked at the council with practiced confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we understand the sentimental attachment to this building. But we must look at the facts. The structure is unsafe. It is a haven for pests. It is an economic drain on the city. Our proposal for a parking structure will create jobs, generate revenue, and provide a necessary service for the downtown area. The video online is poetic, yes, but poetry does not pay bills. Safety and progress do." He sat down, and a few people on the council nodded. It made sense. It was logical. It was the kind of argument that usually won these rooms. Then the mayor looked toward the front row. "Is there anyone who wishes to speak against the demolition?" Maya stood up. Her legs felt shaky, like she might tip over. She walked to the podium at the center of the room. It felt too high, and the microphone loomed in front of her face like a black eye. She looked out at the sea of faces. Hundreds of eyes were on her. The developers were checking their watches. The council members were shuffling papers. They expected her to fail. They expected her to be just another girl with an emotional plea that had no place in a business meeting. Maya took a deep breath. She thought about the piano. She thought about the way the keys felt under her fingers. She realized that she couldn't give them a business speech. She couldn't talk about dollars and cents. She had to talk about what was real. "Hello," she said into the microphone. Her voice sounded small at first, trembling. "My name is Maya. I'm 23 years old." She paused and gripped the sides of the podium. "I know that on paper, the Majestic is just a liability. I know it looks like a wreck. But 6 months ago, I lost my grandmother. She raised me, and when she died, the world went silent for me. I stopped playing music. I stopped feeling anything. I was just surviving." She looked down at her hands for a second, then back up. "The day I found that piano, I wasn't looking for a landmark. I was just looking for a place to hide. But when I touched those keys, something happened. That building isn't just wood and stone. It holds memories. It holds the laughter of thousands of people who sat in those seats. It holds the dreams of the musicians who played on that stage. If we tear it down, we aren't just clearing space for cars. We are erasing the history of the people who lived here." The room was completely silent now. The developer had stopped clicking his pen. The council members were looking at her, actually looking at her, Maya continued, her voice growing stronger. "We live in a world that is very fast. We tear things down to build new things, and then we tear those down. We are always rushing forward, but sometimes we need to stop. We need to listen to the echo. The Majestic taught me that even things that are broken and dusty still have a voice. They still have value. If we destroy this, we are telling everyone that nothing is worth saving unless it makes money. And that is a very lonely way to live." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. I don't have a slideshow. I don't have a chart. But I have this. She pressed play. She held the phone microphone up to the podium mic. For a second, there was just static. Then the sound filled the chamber. It was a recording Leo had sent her from the night before. It was the sound of the piano playing inside the theater, but mixed with the sound of the rain outside and the faint, distant noise of the city. It was the nocturne she had played. It was haunting and clear. Cutting through the stale air of the government room, the sound of the piano seemed to bounce off the high ceilings of the council chamber. It sounded out of place here, too wild and too honest for such a structured room. But it was beautiful. Maya let it play for 30 seconds. She looked at the mayor. He was staring at the table in front of him, his hand resting over his mouth. "This building gave me my voice back," Maya said when the music faded. "Please, don't silence it." She turned and walked back to her seat. She didn't look at the developers. She sat down next to Arthur, put a hand on her shoulder and squeezed it tight. The silence that followed in the room was heavy. It wasn't the sleepy silence of a bureaucracy. It was the silence of people feeling something they hadn't expected to feel. The developer stood up again, looking annoyed. "This is all very touching," he said, "but we have a contract. We have a timeline." Emotions shouldn't dictate city planning. The mayor held up a hand, stopping him. The mayor looked old in that moment, tired of the arguments, tired of the fighting. He looked at the demolition order on his desk. Then he looked at the hundreds of people standing quietly in the back. He looked at Maya. "The permit is signed," the mayor said slowly. "But the funding has not yet been released for the demolition crew." "I move to table the vote for 1 week," one of the council members said suddenly. It was a woman who had been sitting quietly the whole time. "Second," another member chimed in immediately. The mayor looked around the room. "All in favor of tabling the demolition of the old Majestic Theater for 1 week?" The room erupted. Not in shouting, but in a collective gasp. The council members raised their hands, one by one. It wasn't unanimous. A few hands stayed down. It's mostly the ones who had received donations from the developer, but it was enough. The gavel banged. Motion passes. Maya let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for a month. She slumped back in her chair. It wasn't a victory yet. The wolf was still at the door. But the door had been shut, at least for a few more days. Arthur leaned in close to her. "You did it, kid," he whispered, his eyes shining wet. "You made them listen." Maya looked up at the high ceiling of the council room. She realized that the music had done the work. She was just the vessel. And she knew, with a sudden clarity that scared her, that 1 week wasn't enough time. They needed a miracle. She had bought them time, but now she had to find a way to win the war. The week after the council meeting felt like living in a dream. The city that had ignored the old Majestic Theater for decades suddenly couldn't stop talking about it. The video Leo had posted didn't just fade away like most internet trends. It seemed to sink in deeper. People started sharing their own stories. A man posted a picture of his parents on their first date at the Majestic Inn. 1952. A woman talked about seeing her favorite jazz band there in the 70s. The building wasn't just a pile of bricks anymore. It was a scrapbook of the city's history. But good feelings don't pay for construction. The deadline was getting closer. The 1-week reprieve from the city council was almost up. Maya knew that inspiration wasn't enough to stop a wrecking ball. They needed money, and they needed a lot of it. She spent her days on the phone, calling heritage societies, wealthy donors, and anyone she could think of. Most of the time, she was sent to voicemail. On the Friday morning of the deadline, Maya sat on the edge of the stage, swinging her legs. Arthur was sweeping the lobby, humming a tune she didn't recognize. The air in the theater felt heavy, like the weight of the entire world was pressing down on the roof. "I think this is it, Arthur," Maya said softly when he came into the auditorium. Arthur stopped sweeping. He leaned on the broom. "Don't talk like that. The sun isn't down yet." "I called 10 foundations yesterday," she said, her voice tired. "They all said the same thing. It's a liability. It's too expensive to fix." Arthur walked over to the piano and patted the side gently. "You brought this beast back to life, Maya. You found the music in the wood. That counts for something." "It counts for a nice story," she said. but it doesn't stop the bulldozers. Just then, the heavy service door at the back creaked open. Maya didn't look up at first. She assumed it was Leo coming to hang out. But the footsteps were different. They were heavy, confident, and the sound of expensive heels clicking on the concrete echoed through the hall. Maya stood up. Standing at the end of the center aisle was a tall woman in a sharp gray coat. She looked like she belonged in a high-rise office, not in a dusty ruin. Behind her were two men with suits and clipboards.
Hello.
The woman said. Her voice was clear and commanding. Are you the pianist? Maya nodded, wiping her hands on her jeans. I am. The woman walked down the aisle, looking around the room with a critical eye. She didn't look disgusted, though. She looked like she was solving a puzzle. My name is Elena Vance. I'm with the Vance Heritage Foundation. We saw the video, and I saw your appearance at the council meeting. Maya's heart skipped a beat. I sent you an email. I didn't think you read it. I read them all, Elena said, stepping onto the stage. Usually, I delete requests for old buildings. They are money pits. But my husband, he loved music. He passed away last year. When I saw you playing here, sitting in the dust, it reminded me of him. He would have hated to see this place turned into a parking lot. Lena walked over to the piano. She ran a hand along the smooth blacktop. The acoustics in here, even with the roof damaged, are remarkable. You can feel the sound in your chest, as Maya said. That's why I couldn't leave it. Lena turned to her assistants. Draw up the papers. We'll match the city's stabilization grant. We want to buy the deed from the developer and turn it into a community arts center. Maya stood frozen. You're serious? I never joke about $5 million, Elena said, a small smile appearing on her face. Maya let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She threw her arms around Elena, surprising the stiff executive. Elena hesitated for a second, then hugged her back. 6 months later, the night of the grand reawakening finally arrived. The transformation of the Majestic was nothing short of a miracle. It wasn't a sleek, modern renovation. They didn't hide the scars. The cracks in the ceiling were patched but left visible, tracing the lines of history. The velvet seats on the main floor had been restored, but they kept the faded color, loving the wear and tear. The gold leaf on the columns gleamed again, but it shone over old wood that had seen better days. It was honest. It looked like a survivor. The lobby was filled with people. There were wealthy donors in tuxedos and evening gowns, mixing with the neighborhood kids in jeans and the skateboarders who had guarded the doors. There were reporters from every major news network. The air didn't smell of dust anymore. It smelled of fresh coffee, flowers, and floor wax. Backstage, Maya stood in the wings, peeking through the heavy red curtains. Her hands were shaking so much she had to clasp them together. She was wearing a long green dress that her mother had helped her pick out. She felt beautiful, but more importantly, she felt ready. She looked down at the front row. There, in the seat that had been saved specifically for him, sat Arthur. He was wearing his good suit, and he had polished his shoes until they shone. Next to him sat Elena Vance, and next to her was Leo, grinning and holding his phone up to record. The house lights dimmed. The chatter in the audience faded into a hush. A spotlight hit the center of the stage, illuminating the Steinway Grand. It had been professionally tuned and regulated, but it still looked like the same beast Maya had found in the dark. A voice came over the speakers. It was the mayor. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the new Majestic Theater. Tonight, we celebrate the past and we listen to the future. Please welcome the young woman who saved us all, Maya. Maya walked onto the stage. The applause was loud, but it wasn't just polite clapping. It was a roar. It was the sound of hundreds of people standing up at once. It washed over her like a warm wave. She walked to the piano, bowed slightly, and sat down. She adjusted the bench. She took a deep breath, smelling the mixture of the old wood and the new paint. She looked out into the dark sea of faces, but she couldn't see them clearly. She just felt them. She placed her hands on the keys. She didn't start with something flashy. She played the same simple melody she had played on that first rainy afternoon, the day she found the piano. It was the song of loneliness turning into hope. As she played, the notes soared through the hall. The piano sounded incredible, rich and full, filling every corner of the room. But the magic wasn't just in the sound. It was in the silence between the notes. In that silence, you could feel the memories of the theater settling in. You could feel the ghosts of the past nodding their heads in approval. Maya poured everything she had into the music. She played for the city that had forgotten her, for the grandmother she missed, and for the old man in the front row who had never given up. She played with a passion that surprised even her. She wasn't just pressing keys. She was telling the story of how a broken girl and a broken building had fixed each other as the song built to its climax. The music swelled, loud and triumphant. It was a shout of defiance against the darkness, declaration that beauty matters, even in a ruin. She struck the final chord and held it, letting the vibration hum through the floorboards. Then, she lifted her hands into her lap. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. It lasted for 3 seconds. And then, the audience erupted. The applause was deafening. People were on their feet, cheering, whistling, crying. Maya sat there, tears streaming down her face, blurring her vision. She looked at Arthur and saw him wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. She looked at Alina, who was nodding slowly with a look of deep satisfaction. Maya stood up and bowed. Once, twice, 3 times. The majestic theater was alive again. The parking lot was never built. And as Maya stood on the stage, bathed in the spotlight, she realized something profound. She had thought she was saving the building. She had thought she was the hero of the story. But looking out at the faces of the people whose lives had been touched by this place, she knew the truth. The piano had saved her. It gave her a voice when she had none. It gave her a family when she felt alone. It turned her grief into something that could heal others. She touched the keys, and the world changed. And as the curtain began to fall, closing softly on the scene, Maya smiled a real, genuine smile. She was finally home.